Yesterday was quite an extraordinary day in the Russo-Ukrainian war. First of all, Ukraine started off with the biggest Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow. And then later in the day, the Ukrainians offered the olive branch of a ceasefire to Russia. So what is going on? And how do we reconcile these two actions taking place in one day? Привіт, my name is Connor Klein and welcome to Geopolitics with me, Connor Klein. I'm an expert in international relations and I've been living in Ukraine for many years, speak both Ukrainian and Russian, so I'm here to give you a more unique and insightful perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So yesterday, as I began today's video with, Ukraine launched this massive drone attack on Moscow. A few people were apparently killed and Russia claimed they shut down all the drones that were sent. There were obviously some people killed, so some of them either reached their target or they were killed by the debris falling. It's very hard to get a real sense of how much damage was done by this attack by Ukraine on Moscow. However, it does demonstrate Ukraine's capacity to hit Russia's capital with such a large attack. And it was, I guess, a demonstration of force and goes against what Donald Trump has been saying about Ukraine's position, not holding any cards, that basically they've lost the war, they started the war, they have a dictator, all this ridiculous stuff that Donald Trump has been saying over the last few weeks. Even more so in light of what happened later in the day in Saudi Arabia, where there were talks between US officials and Ukrainian officials, and suddenly Ukraine offering a ceasefire. It actually makes more sense they fired a large number of drones at Moscow a few hours basically before they announced this offer, because, well, if Russia accepts the ceasefire offer, then presumably they will not be firing those drones for the next while. Whether that turns out to be 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, let's see. So we had this big demonstration of force by Ukraine, and then later on today, a bit of a surprise. There were these talks in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And of course, you're probably aware that the US in the last week has cut off intel sharing with the Ukrainians. A little bit of ambiguity about, is it just for defensive or offensive purposes? But in this kind of war, how do you draw the distinction between defensive intel and offensive intel? I'm not really sure. It's probably going to be basically blurry, that line. Also, there was speculation that the US was about to shut off Starlink, on which Ukraine is to a certain extent dependent for its communications. That was denied them by Elon Musk, who owns Starlink. And actually, the Russians are also using Starlink unofficially, so that would kind of be a double-edged sword in the war if that was, on the balance of power, if that were turned off, because it would also apparently adversely affect Russia, presumably to a lesser extent than Ukraine, so they're not as dependent on it. And we had, obviously, the humanitarian aid, financial aid has already been cut off. USAID has been gutted by Elon Musk, and Ukraine was the biggest recipient of that aid, plus new US aid going to Ukraine has also been paused. The executive branch, Donald Trump, as US president, does not actually have the authority to cancel that military aid that's already been appropriated by the Biden administration when obviously Joe Biden was president, but they can pause it for a short amount of time. That has been done. In Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine went to the negotiations, because effective at this point, it looks more like the US is actually negotiating on behalf of Russia, not really an intermediary anymore. Definitely leaning very heavily towards Russia's position. They haven't really demanded anything in terms of concessions from Russia in the last few weeks, but they're demanding all the time concessions from Ukraine, like they give up part of their territory, that they don't join NATO, and that they basically have a ceasefire without any security guarantees or any real assurance that Russia won't just restart hostilities. So Ukraine went into that offering a sea and air ceasefire to a certain extent, that what we saw in Moscow in the morning, that wouldn't happen, that Ukraine wouldn't fire drones into Russia and Russia wouldn't fire its drones and its missiles, ballistic missiles in particular, at Ukraine. Actually, they even overnight, when I looked at the news this morning, Russia hit a vessel coming out of Odessa port, or docked in Odessa port, transporting grain out of the country, and apparently 4 Syrian citizens were killed because they were crew on that ship. So this is something that Ukraine has proposed, that would be the ceasefire, that there would be no attacks by air, also by sea. There isn't so much going on by sea. Basically, the Black Sea Fleet of Russia, which was stationed in occupied Crimea, is basically defunct. It doesn't serve much purpose at this point in the war. It has effectively been defeated by the Ukrainians, primarily because they used both ballistic missiles and they used sea drones to weaken the Russian Navy and sink many of their vessels, most notably the Moskva, which was the flagship. That was actually sunk by a Neptune missile, apparently right back, if I remember, it's Neptune, right back basically in 2022, which was a Ukrainian-produced missile. So basically they were suggesting that they would not have a ceasefire on the line of contact in terms of the land war or in the part of Russia that Ukraine occupies currently in the Kursk Oblast around Sudzha, and that they would have this pause in fighting. This would be a sign that Ukraine is serious about peace, in inverted commas, and actually not make much of a substantive difference on the ground. It would not obviously affect too much the fighting on land and where the lines of contact are. However, I'll read out the statement from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Something different has been agreed with the American delegation in Saudi Arabia. So Zelensky says, at this meeting with the Americans, Ukraine proposed 3 key points: silence in the skies, which I just outlined, stopping missile strikes, bombs, and long-range drone attacks, silence at sea, real confidence-building measures in this whole situation, in which diplomacy is ongoing, which primarily means the release of prisoners and detainees, both military and civilian, and the return of Ukrainian children who were forcibly transferred to Russia. So those are other demands by Ukraine, that basically they have a POW swap, so prisoners of war swap on both sides, and that I think it's tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children who were kidnapped by Russia, particularly those that were orphans or their parents were killed during the fighting. They were then moved to Russia and in many cases given up for adoption to be Russified, that those children are returned. That is something I'm very skeptical that Russia would agree to, but let's go on down through it. During today's talks, the US side proposed taking an even bigger first step, a 30-day full interim ceasefire, not only stopping missile, drone, and bomb attacks, not only in the Black Sea, but also along the entire front line. So that is a general ceasefire, cessation of hostilities for 30 days. Ukraine is ready to accept this proposal. We see it as a positive step, and we are ready to take it. Now, it is up to the United States to convince Russia to do the same. If Russia agrees, the ceasefire will take effect immediately. So basically, Ukraine has agreed to this 30-day ceasefire. They are now going to wait and see what the Americans can convince Russia to do, whether Russia will accept it. I'll run through in a few seconds Russia's options at this point. I am personally surprised that Ukraine would take this risk. In a quid pro quo, the US has already turned back on the intelligence sharing and the military supplies from the US to Ukraine. The Polish foreign minister, who had obviously was in my video yesterday, is a spat with Elon Musk and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, Władysław Sikorski. He said this morning that indeed they can confirm that US military supplies to Ukraine have recommenced. So that was a quick quote for Ukraine agreeing to this. However, it is very high risk, and for Ukraine to accept a ceasefire without any security guarantees, without any progress towards long-term security for Ukraine, definitely carries a lot of calculated risks, because if the pause in fighting is used by Russia to rebuild its military and be in a better position, either on the battlefield or in negotiations with Ukraine, then having a pause in fighting would have been to the detriment of Ukraine and its position. So looking at it now, Russia has a few choices. The noises out of Russia, looking at Maria Zakharova and Russian state TV, it was either neutral about whether they were going to accept the ceasefire, or it was just outward deeply hostile to the idea that basically they should push on, look, Ukraine is a weak position, America is doing our bidding for us. That's kind of the general overview of their feeling. However, it will ultimately be up to one man in Russia. It's a dictatorship, so Vladimir Putin is going to make that decision. So he has a few options in front of him. Option number one would be to just reject the ceasefire, say, no, Ukraine needs to agree to what would amount to a capitulation. Russia, remember, wants to have political control of Ukraine at a minimum. So not necessarily that they would control the territory formally, but that they would be able to install a puppet government in Kyiv. Remember, one of the key demands in 2022 by Vladimir Putin was for denazification. That's just a propaganda word for regime change in Kyiv and putting in a pliant leader in Kyiv. And therefore, they would be able to control Ukraine and maybe even potentially convert them into an ally for an attack somewhere else in the future in Europe. You just have to look at Lukashenko in Belarus and how Russia was able to use Belarusian territory in 2022 to attack the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, to see a pliant leader to a certain extent. And that is probably the most likely decision that Russia will take. They will see if they can actually get Donald Trump and the US administration to put more pressure on Ukraine, cut off the aid again to try and demand more concessions, and then they can decide whether they want a ceasefire when they've in a stronger position during that ceasefire to extract pretty fatal concessions out of Ukraine. That's why I said it's a huge risk by Zelensky to do this. His popularity is quite high in Ukraine, especially after his contretemps with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump in the Oval Office, and even before that with Trump calling him a dictator and saying that he did not support. So his support has risen quite considerably in Ukraine, at least 10 to 15 percentage points. However, agreeing to something like a ceasefire in this case could potentially weaken his position. So that is the most likely, looking at the reaction so far from Moscow. Doesn't mean it's a given, but that will be one tactic that Russia could do, is just say no and demand more concessions and see if the new US administration is actually going to take any action against Russia, because so far all they have done is make concessions to Russia. They've weakened Ukraine's position. They cut off, obviously, the aid, financial, humanitarian, and military, cut off their intel, and even compromised the functionality of the F-16 fighters that Ukraine has, that were not actually sent by the US, but sent by other countries. Obviously, they are US military planes. So then in that situation where Donald Trump doesn't seem to be able to do anything or willing to do anything meaningful against Russia, and maybe he's not even capable because he's not willing to supply the Ukrainians to win the war, then that would be one strategy. Would make probably the most sense, is my gut feeling, from a Russian point of view. However, there are other options. Option number two is to agree to the ceasefire with absolutely no intention of respecting it, even within the initial 30-day period. Russia could then say, we agree to the ceasefire, and then within a week or 3 weeks, just violate it and blame the Ukrainians. Just say, oh, the Ukrainians violated, they're not respecting the terms, and just start firing rockets and restart the war. And in that argument in the Oval Office, Zelensky was pointing out to J.D. Vance, in particular, that they had 25 ceasefire agreements with Russia, and Russia broke every single one of them since 2014, including when Donald Trump was the US president in his first term. So why would anyone actually expect Russia to respect the terms of a ceasefire? So that would be one thing they could do. They could agree to the ceasefire, and just with the intention of violating it pretty quickly. That way they would be able to maybe frame the narrative better and say, listen, we wanted peace, we agreed to the ceasefire, and look, those dastardly Ukrainians, they broke it, even if it is Russia breaking it. Then the third option is that Russia agrees to the ceasefire and actually plans to respect it. And the rationale for that would be if Vladimir Putin actually believes that the US is going to force Ukraine to capitulate, something that Russia invading Ukraine since 2014 has not managed to achieve, even with North Korean soldiers, even with Iranian drones, even with the military support also from North Korea and to a certain extent from China. They have not been able to achieve that, but perhaps with the assistance of the United States and Donald Trump, they could force Ukraine to capitulate, and that would basically mean accepting no security guarantees or any real long-term deterrence from a new Russian invasion that would cause political consternation in Ukraine, possibly allow Russia to even overthrow the government and install a leader that was more favorable to the Kremlin, or at the very least just weaken Ukrainian national resolve. And presumably Ukraine in that scenario would not be able to reclaim its territories, maybe even be forced to give them up legally. I can't really see how a Ukrainian leader can sign that kind of agreement, because there wouldn't be no public support for it to actually legally recognize the occupied territories as being Russian. That would also create a huge problem as a precedent in international law, basically mean that we don't have any sovereignty territorially, because you have to just think back to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for assurances that, yes, international law would be respected, that its borders would be respected by Russia, and the US signed it, and that they would enforce that. It was already the law anyways under international law, and even Vladimir Putin even signed new agreements recognizing the borders and made public statements saying Crimea is Ukrainian, and they just violated that. He violated that. Russia violated that going forward, Moscow. So that would be the reason for Vladimir Putin, if he calculates that he can actually achieve his goals by agreeing to the ceasefire, because Donald Trump is basically going to force the Ukrainians to capitulate, then that would make sense. The other factor to throw in is, can Russia really prosecute this war for much longer? Maybe they need, I guess we could have said there's a fourth option, that they agree to ceasefire but don't plan to violate immediately. They actually want to rebuild their military, have a soft landing for the economy, because their economy is in a lot of trouble, their manpower, they have an issue with recruiting compared to before, and that would mean possibly needing mobilization in Russia, another one. And they have a huge problem with materiel, because they've been refurbishing old Soviet-era stocks, but they're starting to run out of those. And actually, if they prosecute the war to the same extent as they did in 2024, for 2025, they will run out of those resources, and they would need solutions to all of those three major problems by the end of the year. So one other, I guess, fourth strategy would be to accept the ceasefire with the intention of respecting it and getting it renewed after 1 month, but then just using that time period to rearm the military, rekit it, and then get ready either to reinvade Ukraine or actually attack somewhere else. Could be, maybe not even the region, could go to Georgia. Well, Georgia's government is pretty pliant at the moment, but could be to intimidate somewhere else, Kazakhstan, somewhere else, another country in its near abroad, or actually to prepare for an attack on the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or Poland through Suwalki Gap, because they could free up those soldiers that are on the line of contact, those battle-hardened soldiers that have the experience, and then they could quickly move them and actually launch an invasion, or at least undermine the credibility of Article 5 of NATO, because if they, for example, just took a small village somewhere and, had plausible deniability, we don't know who those people are, a bit like what they did in Crimea, would the US now come to the aid of whatever country it happens to be? It looks very unlikely, judging by the statements of Donald Trump, that actually the US would defend such a piece of territory. You just have to think back to 1930s. One of the clarion calls of the French fascists with respect to not standing up to German expansionism was, why die for Danzig? Actually sounds better in English than in French. It was, pourquoi mourir pour Danzig? Danzig is Gdansk nowadays in Poland, but basically Germany took this part, and it was a small city that had a different status because after World War I in the interim period, and because no one did anything there, like they hadn't done in effect when Germany took the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia and the Anschluss with their unification with Austria, they just took it as another signal to go further, and it undermined the credibility of the, I guess we can call them back in the day, security guarantees by France and Germany to Poland. So that's the range of the options that I see on this. We're just still in the morning here in the Baltic states where I am. And let me know down in the comment section what you think about the ceasefire proposal. Do you think Russia will accept it? What do you think Russia's motivations will be to either accept it or to reject it? Do you think it was a good idea by Zelensky? Do you think it was a wide strategic move to get the intel and the supplies turned back on, but he had to offer this olive branch to Russia as a quid pro quo? Was that a good strategic move? And what you think about the role of the US administration? Is the US administration under Donald Trump an honest broker between Russia and Ukraine, or is it actually advocating for one of the sides, and that one side would seem at this point to be Russia, which makes no strategic sense in terms of the US foreign policy of the last 80 years to be advocating for Russia. However, there is a broader strategic idea that because the US is more concerned about China, they want to ply Russia away from China, which seems a little bit naive to me that that would actually be possible and be worthwhile in the sense of what they would have to give to Russia, which is basically part of Europe, it would seem, in order to convince them to do that, and whether that would be the best strategic move from the US's point of view. So on that point, I will say, Slava Ukraini, do перемоги, even though we have a ceasefire proposal by Ukraine, and I will be back tomorrow because I feel like there's going to be a lot of developments with respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war and these potential negotiations and ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine.